All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for today's Expert Speaker Series. Today, we have the pleasure of welcoming John Hicks, Principal of DLB Hicks LLC, to discuss grant seeking in the new normal. This webinar is sponsored by JMT Consulting. We're an ERP and financial management solutions firm with 30 years experience working exclusively with nonprofit organizations. We work with a wide variety of software partners to find the best solution for your nonprofit, and we also provide free resources like this webinar to our valued nonprofit community. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. If you have any questions during the webinar, please submit it in the question section on your control panel. John will answer those at the conclusion of the webinar. You'll also receive a survey following today's session asking you to let us know how we did. And within 24 hours, you'll receive an email containing the webinar recording and slides, just in case you want to revisit the material or share it with a colleague. And finally, I would like to introduce John Hicks. He's principal and founder of DLB Hicks LLC, a consulting practice that provides grant seeking and fundraising guidance and support to nonprofit organizations from grassroots to global. Over a consulting career of more than 30 years, John has worked with a diverse group of more than 100 nonprofits, both in the US and abroad. So thank you, John, and I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much. And I am super happy to be here today and have an opportunity to talk a bit about grant seeking in the new normal. I think if we keep doing this webinar, it's probably going to pick up a few news as we go along because this landscape is definitely changing. And so what I want to do today is to talk about some ideas regarding practices that nonprofits might follow to be efficient, be effective in grant seeking. We're going to talk a bit about how the landscape and the process is changing and how we might adapt to those changes. So I'm looking forward to not only sharing the information that I have, but also hearing from you through your questions. So there definitely will be time for those at the conclusion of the presentation. So with that as an introduction, why don't we get started? I think we should start here, which is to acknowledge the obvious. We are in the midst of what might be best described as a perfect storm. In the introduction, which mentions that I've been a consultant for more than 30 years, I always say that I started when I was 5. Um, I think I've gone through any number of crisis moments like 9/11 or the tech bubble bursting or at least 2 recessions, one of them pretty severe. Um, and here's what I think we all know that anytime we've had a crisis, while there's a hiccup, there might be a hiccup in giving, we always rebound from it. But we're at a point right now where we have 3 crises or three significant challenges facing us. I mean, the pandemic, it is what it is. Social unrest. I mean, we're having a long overdue conversations about diversity and equity in this country, and those are taking place at the same time we're talking about the pandemic. And of course, a recession, which some days and some months is a recession, and some months it doesn't look so recessionary. It just kind of depends on what the market is doing, and of course, folks who are out of work, and we're trying to get that situation turned around. So all of this is having an impact on the sector, which is just it's unprecedented, and I think a lot of us are trying to feel our way forward. Um, I guess the way I always think of looking at these 3 overlapping circles here, what we're living through is, we can look at this as extreme crisis, or I think we can also look at it as this is truly the moment for nonprofits because we are here as wonderful resources for constituencies and communities. And that's a backdrop, and that's a theme that we're going to come back to when we talk about um, best practices in communicating to grant makers and engaging grant makers. Another thing just to acknowledge is just again going back to impact, and I've been following a number of surveys that have been put out with regularity by CAF America, which is basically an organization that manages and advises donor advised funds. And they've been doing surveys roughly every 2 to 3 months since the start of the pandemic, looking at the impact on the sector. And you can go to their website and access all the reports. This is the one taken, this graphic here is taken from a report that was issued in December of 2020, which looks at surveys that they've conducted with various groups of nonprofit organizations. And you can see it that we ended the year with fully 93% of charities reporting to CAF that they feel that they've been impacted negatively in any number of ways, ranging from financial to programmatic to mission. So we're not out of the woods here. And again, if you sort of compare this sort of an arc and the kinds of numbers that we're seeing here, this is exponentially higher than any negative impacts reported from the sector from any prior disasters or prior recessionary periods. I'm including this background because I think, to state the obvious, funders are aware of it. And I think that funders are trying to shift. At least, that's been our experience and what we're seeing and what we're hearing. And again, we're going to talk a bit about, how do we take that awareness and make it work for us in terms of the fundraising that we're trying to do. Another piece of information I've included here, and again, you'll be getting the slides, is a survey that was done in September of 2020 by Foundation Search. And this is an organization that actually manages donor advised funds and also manages trusts for independent foundations. And in surveying their own client base as well as other funders, they found that nearly 40% of the respondents said our foundation mission has actually shifted since the beginning of 2020, meaning that they're accommodating and making changes for the changes that are happening societally and what's happening in our communities. And that means that grant makers in the aggregate are trying to be as responsive as they can be. The fact that more than 40% of them have increased the dollar amount of grant making, and that when you look at a comparative year over year comparison, between 2019 and 2020, at least, for the March June period, 45% increase in total dollar amounts granted, and at least some little uptick in the total number of grants issued. So the sector, again, is trying to respond, and it means the foundations have been going into the money that they've been earning or did earn in the stock market in 2019 and put that money to use in 2020 to to respond to what charities need, and by way of making more grants and maybe some larger grants. And we're going to talk just a moment about what that number might look like, or at least some indicators for 2021. Now, hot off the press, as I was putting the finishing touches on a couple of slides this morning, I checked my news feed and saw that, lo and behold, Candid and the Center for Disaster Philanthropy released a report this morning that took a look at philanthropy and COVID-19 for the year 2020. So I thought I'd drop a few figures and numbers in here. And by the way, I would really encourage you to go to candid.org. So that's the website for Candid. And you can get a copy of this report. It's about 25 pages long, and it's definitely worth taking a look at for some of the trends that we might be talking about here. But what the report is telling us is, well, unfortunately, it's not telling us anything here, is it? So, here we go. Thank you very much. That will be hopefully the only technical hiccup we're going to have in the next few minutes. So more than $20 billion in grants and gifts identified. Now, I'm saying grants and gifts here because this includes money from corporations, and sometimes they kind of characterize or classify these as gifts. So think of this as institutional philanthropy. This also, by the way, includes individual major donor gifts. So 71% of this 20 billion plus came from, specifically from institutional grants and gifts, and this is from foundations and corporations of all different shapes and sizes. Now, most money, 44% was given by corporations and corporate foundations. And this is usually what one sees in a response to a disaster, so to speak. So, a disaster situation, corporations tend to respond generously. Um, and so, in terms of just the habit of it, there's not a huge surprise here. But one thing that I think we are seeing is that corporations are becoming better philanthropic citizens, and that maybe there's been some changes in attitudes on the part of shareholders and boards about making grant contributions. And it's something that I think charities need to be thinking about a bit more. 22% 22% of total gifts came through independent foundations. Um, so when we talk about 22% coming from total foundations or independent foundations, those are foundations like the Ford Foundation or the Gates Foundation. And so this is pretty important when we're thinking about, how do we, target some of the grant makers that we're trying to approach. And the highest number of grants, so when we look at individual contributions uh, by foundations, that comes from community foundations. So when you look at your local community foundation, you'll see the largest number of individual gifts. And by the way, the average of these gifts from community foundations is $10,000 per contribution. So that's also pointing to some fundraising that we might want to think about as we move into 2021. So what might we expect for 2021? I mean, is there any way of knowing? Well, one indicator for foundation giving that we tend to look at is basically the stock market. There's a conventional wisdom that foundations will base their contributions budgets on how they performed over the last year or possibly 2 years in the stock market. And that anytime one goes into a recessionary period, a foundation, because it's giving money based on good years in the market, will trail the recession, so to speak. So their giving will remain strong going into a recession. And if the recession continues, that's when you'll begin to see foundation contributions going down. So the graphic I've chosen here is from the Fidelity 2020 stock market report. So looking at the S&P 500 index, last year was a roller coaster. I mean, anybody who looked at their 401k plan, their IRA, your own investments, you saw a trend line that looked very much like this. So year starts out a little under 3,300, ends a little past 3,700. So one expectation that we have is because foundations are coming off of two really good years, 2019, and they also realized some gains on their portfolios in 2020, chances are that giving from foundations and giving from corporate foundations are likely or is likely to remain at least steady or possibly strong going into 2021. It's early to be able to tell that, but just anecdotally, looking at the work that we're doing with different nonprofit organizations, we haven't seen any significant shortfalls. Um, the one little hiccup that I think it's worth paying attention to is that some funders did give very generously, or maybe even overgave generously to COVID in 2020. So at worst, what we've seen are some delayed decisions going into 2021, where foundations are moving grant requests to a later date for decisions. So there may be some delays in the grant funding and decisions that we might be expecting. So that's something, again, it's worth noting, worth paying attention to. So where does this leave us? I'm always one who is trying to look for opportunities. And so the opportunities that at least I'm seeing and that I'm thinking about starts with COVID. As of today, this morning, when I looked on the Candid website, so when you go to candid.org, they also have a part of their website where they are actively tracking the number of grant programs that are dedicated to COVID. So you can find that part of their website, just do search COVID, you can actually do a search for your own community and find out which COVID funds are available. So there's 957 of these programs, still currently in operation. And anecdotally, what I hear from some grant makers is that they're going to continue to hold money aside for COVID relief because we're not out of the pandemic yet. There's new grant opportunities for charities looking at issues related to disparities, especially if you're an organization that's working in the arena of looking at social determinants of health, social determinants of education, social determinants of general well-being. So human service sector nonprofits seem to still be in a good place in terms of their relationships with foundations, as with healthcare being possibly another arena. Funders are rethinking restrictions on general operating support. This has been one of the most refreshing and exciting new conversations that's taking place in the foundation community at large, where foundation leaders are realizing that it's very important to be rethinking some of the restrictions they've traditionally had on unrestricted support, because charities simply need money to keep the doors open. They're cognizant of that. 93% of charities reporting to groups like CAF that we're not out of the woods yet because of the pandemic. Progress in the fight against COVID-19 is beginning to bring funders back to mission. So as we're coming into the new year and we have vaccines on the horizon, more vaccines on the horizon, if we continue to make progress against COVID-19, and we all hope we do, a lot of funders are talking about getting back to their core missions. So this means that uh, foundations are still thinking and are thinking ahead on how do they begin to steer money back to the things that they have traditionally funded. And so that means that one of the things we have to think about on the nonprofit side is what are our plans to get back to mission as well. And so that's something we are going to talk about. And then finally, just to repeat, I mean, we come off of 2 years of double-digit market gains. So there's still money out there in foundations, and there is still money in corporate foundations, and maybe even in corporate contributions programs. But quite possibly, grants can be for some charities, and we mentioned this in the announcement for this webinar, so to speak, a safe harbor. So if some of our individual giving may be at danger of declining due to some of the economic challenges that our donors may be facing, foundations, corporations may be in a good position to step into the gap and to help charities moving forward and helping us get through this little period so we can do what we need to do. Which brings us to the fundamental question that we're going to address today in this webinar, which is how do we successfully compete for grants and how do we make the most of the opportunities that we're seeking? Well, for starters, I'd like us to think about rapid response. I think one of the things that has changed in our work, so personally speaking, when I look at the work we do with clients, and I would say a lot of you on this webinar today are experiencing this as well, um, the nature and the speed of the work is changing. I find that one, we have to do daily research and we have to do daily prospecting, and we have to be prepared to quickly respond to opportunities. I mean, one of the things I am seeing is new RFPs, coming online from foundations, corporations, sometimes even donor advised funds with very short turnaround times. So being able to respond, find the opportunities rapidly, respond to them rapidly, is something that's now with us. And that was not really the case pre-pandemic, because back then foundations were, I think, doing the usual once or twice a year open RFP process. Now I find that we are constantly working under deadlines, and I'm sure many of you feel the same. Um, and I think to this point, one of the things that you would be advised to do, and we all should be advised to do, is to have our ask in mind already. And I think the best way of describing this is being prepared to go to a foundation with a proposal that demonstrates that you have a plan for at least the next 6 months, and you have realistic financial needs of how to get there. So one of the most common questions that I'm seeing presented to charities who are being vetted for grants is, essentially, what kind of cash reserve do you have, and what's your financial plans for managing your way through the next, say, 6 months to 12 months? Um, by the way, the question back during the height of the pandemic, or the first wave of the pandemic, go back to May, June of 2020, and foundations were asking for 3-month plans. So at the very least, where do we need to be, or where can we be in the next 6 months? This is another thing, if we're going to respond rapidly, to not overthink the proposal process. A lot of funders who want quick proposals are trying to make this as easy as possible for us. And this ranges from, I'll take a funder here in our own backyard in New York City, the Robin Hood Foundation, which traditionally can be a fairly complicated application for any nonprofit. But if you're applying for COVID relief, you're asked to describe your needs in about 250 words to 500 words. So they want to make this as easy as possible. Many of you also, and I was just speaking with a colleague this morning about Start Small, which is a new giving program that has been created by Jack Dorsey. I mean, literally, if you go to Start Small and you want to apply for a grant, have a good solid paragraph prepared, and that's about all you need. So the idea is, if they're making this easy for us, that's great. And if the opportunities are coming fast, that's great, but we just have to constantly look for them. So that daily research is awfully important. If you haven't done this, absolutely go to Candid and subscribe to Philanthropy News Digest, and also subscribe to something called the RFP Bulletin. So you'll get daily emails that will give you news on what's happening with grants, and will also give you daily lists of new requests for proposals that are coming online. So there's a way you can push a lot of this, directly into your email on a daily basis. Another thing that I think that charities are doing, the ones who are doing a good job of raising money, and I'm watching this happen, with again, our own clients, is finding relevance. And what we mean by this is that COVID and social unrest and the recession and our need to respond to the challenges in our communities presents a certain set of needs and opportunities. And of course, there's just fundamentally, what do we as a charity do? The overlap between the two is really what defines your relevance. So it's the question of, why us, why now? Now, I've included a quote on this slide, focusing on the problem, not just your programs will ensure the most important needs are met. This is from an article that was posted up on Bridgespan. So if you go to bridgespan.org, their website, and you can basically do a search on Ann May Chang, who's a Bridgespan fellow, you're going to find this article on Beyond Survival, 5 Keys to Unlock Social Innovation Amid the COVID-19 Crisis. It's a pretty long title, but she includes 5 really good ideas that charities need to be thinking about in terms of, how do we take our programs and think about reinventing them? How do we innovate? How do we respond creatively? Charities that are doing this are finding themselves at a competitive advantage when it comes to grants. And so I would encourage all of us here participating in the webinar today to take the time to, go and avail yourself of her wisdom on the topic. Another thing I think we have to think about is sharpening the message, and this kind of relates to, defining your relevance. And it's one thing to define it. It's another thing to actually tell the world about it and tell grant makers about it. And I think there's 4 fundamental questions that we're being asked to address in grant applications. probably related to relevance. One is, what challenges have been created for your community and your audience that you are uniquely positioned to meet? So it's thinking about what is coming online by way of new challenges, or maybe it's just deepened challenges. So, for example, you may be a food bank or a feeding program. You've always been in that business, probably, unfortunately, always will be. But the crisis has deepened in a lot of different ways, and some of the challenges that have emerged on the side of service delivery, those are entirely new. So how are you uniquely positioned to meet those challenges? So it's, thinking about what is our way forward. And that's going to be the thing that's going to be compelling for a lot of people who are reading your grant proposals. And related to that, again, is how are you uniquely meeting them? And this means not only how are you positioned to meet them, but what are you actually doing? And I think that's the one thing that we see across the entire sector is there's a lot of very creative and thoughtful improvisation taking place. And just as an aside, I had a colleague ask me, um, oh gosh, this was a few months ago, what's different about this crisis than other crises that you've been through? And the first thing that came to mind for me is that in this crisis, I haven't seen nonprofits flinch. I have been continually impressed by how many charities have just quickly stepped up to the plate, and they are walking right into the challenge, and they're meeting it. I haven't seen or experienced the wringing of hands. I haven't seen people or nonprofits, stopping and not being able to respond. Nonprofits are responding, and I think foundations are excited by that. And I suspect that all of the questions I'm putting up here, you can answer them, and you can answer them in a compelling way. So how are you uniquely meeting them? How have you adapted programmatically, financially? So this means that, just simply, what has been the way you've taken your programs, and how are you offering them virtually? If you are experiencing some challenges in your funding streams, how have you been creative in meeting those challenges? Or if it's incredibly difficult to meet them without the help of the funders, basically, how are you going to use their money creatively to do the things that you are doing and you're doing extraordinarily well? And also, what is your vision moving forward? I think that there's an expectation among people who work in the grant making business is that the sector is going to come out of this not the same as it was before. I mean, we're all working differently, we're all serving differently. And I think that one of the things that program officers are asking on site visits, albeit virtually by Zoom, we all live on Zoom, is, basically, how do you see your agency after the pandemic is over? What's going to change? What's going to be the lasting fundamental changes? And so those are some deep questions to think about. But I think the charities who can answer them thoughtfully have compelling stories to tell. And compelling stories are going to be the thing that really lifts your application and your grant proposal. Always has and probably always will. Related to all of this, I think we have to also think not only differently about the stories that we're telling, but I think we have to think a bit differently about, the rationale for fundraising, and how we're setting goals. And I want to share with you a matrix that I've been using with increasing frequency with clients, and hopefully this is going to be helpful for all of you. Um, I think we're being asked by grant makers to think about what are our immediate needs and what are the immediate opportunities. And when I think about what's happening in the here and now, we're just like with everything. We divide our financial needs into operating expenses and program expenses. So it's like keeping the doors open and doing what we do. So it's the power and the product, so to speak. Um, so in terms of the immediate, what we're really talking about is core expenses. What are our core expenses? What do we need in order just to remain in business, remain afloat, and be here for the people who need us the most? And what are the things that we are absolutely trying, come hell or high water, to continue in 2021, 2022, until things get back to some semblance of normal? I mean, we just need to be able to answer those questions at a minimum. But for some grant makers who want to deepen the investment, and these might be grant makers that you're bringing online who have never funded you before, but you're the right charity to support now because of COVID, because of your response to some of the social problems that are emerging, social opportunities that are emerging. Their questions kind of get at, in terms of your operations, what kind of capacity do you need to build? I mean, how do you need to go beyond your core expenses to add the capacity to enable you to grow or sustain any of the changes that you've made in your programs? And of course, program creation. This kind of fundraising has always been with us. And, yeah, foundations do like to fund new things, but what are the new things that you are looking to create in response to the pandemic and post-pandemic world? So these are kind of the questions that I think we have to get at as we are, preparing to go out and have conversations with foundations. So literally, you can take this kind of a matrix and you can sit with the staff and your colleagues and you can brainstorm through them. So, what are we including in the budget just to keep ourselves afloat? And what do we need to possibly add by way of capacity? What are the core costs of just keeping our programs in business and doing the essential things we need to do? And what opportunities do we have to expand or enhance our programs? We have to be armed with answers to all those kinds of questions in order, I think, to have the kind of conversations that grant makers seem to be looking to have these days. Then there are the intangibles. And what I mean by intangibles is it's the things that you can do that can help build your awareness with foundations. And I think that there's a conventional wisdom that, when a program officer gets your grant proposal, either electronically or through snail mail, um, that if they've heard of you before, yeah, they're probably going to take a bit closer look. I mean, I think that's a given. It's human nature. So one of the things that I've been thinking about and observing with charities that are doing a really good job of raising money during the pandemic is, these are charities that are giving thought to building what I call VQ, the visibility quotient. So three things to think about when it comes to VQ that seem to be important to grant makers. One is thought leadership. And it's a given because foundations are the ultimate investors. I mean, this is like basically B2B philanthropy, if you will. They want to invest with organizations where the CEO or the program leadership, maybe the board leadership sometimes, is looked to as thought leaders within the field. And so, one of the things I've been trying to encourage clients to do, particularly CEOs and chief program officers and program directors, is to start publishing more results, more observations online. And this is where honestly I'm going to give a big, huge plug to LinkedIn, because a lot of people who work with foundations, be it as a board member or as a professional, just my observation is a lot of those folks hang out on LinkedIn. So, they can either subscribe to your agency feeds, or you may be able to just actually ping them and connect with them. And so that whatever you're putting up is, again, going into their LinkedIn feed. So we have this opportunity to talk publicly, very thoughtfully, about the pandemic. What does it mean for us? What is happening within 5 blocks of where we are working? I mean, how is it affecting our constituency? So if we're adding thought leadership to the conversation, that helps with credibility. And credibility is a big element that comes into play in considering a grant request. Creative leadership, and this means that if you are thinking creatively about engaging with the community, engaging with your peers, forming alliances or consortia projects, I mean, that's another way of building VQ. Credible leadership, and credible leadership can be established by either creating, for example, um, committees or joining committees or teams where you and other CEOs or your CEO and other CEOs are talking deeply and thoughtfully about the entire community as a whole. So we have a couple of clients who have done an extraordinary job of this in terms of looking at what has been the impact of some of the issues, recession, pandemic, social unrest on their communities, and they've engaged political leaders and nonprofit leaders and some very public discussions on this. So leadership is going to be really, really, really important, I think, at this point, and even moving forward to getting your charity to stand out. Another thing, which is kind of a given, is strengthening the network. So this is a great time to be talking to your peers and, of course, talking to grantors. I mean, one of the things I'm encouraging clients to do, and um, a lot of them do this, is to go back to their existing grantors and just saying, basically, we're trying to bring in more money to build out programs. And do you have colleagues in the foundation world or the corporate funding world that might be interested in learning more about us? A surprising number of those grant makers have said, sure, I'd be happy to drop an email or make a call because they want you to be sustainable. So this is the time to try to have those conversations. In terms of just the actual work that we are doing, two things to keep in mind. One is, even though I've been talking about doing daily research and finding opportunities, the name of the game here is you have to be putting product into the pipeline. And what I mean by this is you're going to have to be putting out grant applications and proposals, not on a periodic basis necessarily, and not just on a responsive basis, but finding grant makers that have open applications or have future deadlines, putting those on the calendar and getting things out. So this means building a monthly sustained outreach, making sure that you have proposals going out every single month, and that it's just this is not like seasonal fundraising. Also making sure that you're not only looking at the immediate needs, the emergency needs, but looking at future opportunities. So this means that you'll have some grant makers that want to respond very short term to things like COVID, but there's a lot of foundations that are remaining on mission. Don't forget to ask those foundations for money. So this means even if they have a deadline coming up in June or November, flag it, make sure that you're submitting the application to get yourself in front of them, and including both leaders and followers. And what I mean by this is that it's a mix. It can be large foundations, it can be small foundations. Remember that number that was shared with us, or those numbers shared with us by Candid about COVID giving in 2020. Yeah, there's a lot of foundations that gave really huge money in response to COVID, but the greatest number of gifts came out of community foundations at a level, a median level of $10,000. So there's also small contributions that can help, get the money that you absolutely need. And investing the time in engaging. And this means that, direct contact. I'm actually finding that funders have been more accessible because of the pandemic. Maybe they're like all of us. They come and sit at one desk and um, and seem to be a little bit more accessible to have preliminary conversations. Also, taking the time, if you can, to put together, this is an age-old tactic, the funder briefing, which means getting one of your grant makers to maybe host a briefing on a topic related to your mission and programming, and inviting other funders to be part of it. That also relates to, again, thought leadership. And then partnering. I think partnering is a really big part of the equation when it comes to leveraging money out of foundations. One of the things that a lot of folks, or an increasing number of folks who work on the foundation and corporate giving side, are saying is we're really looking for agencies, if possible, to come in working together and collaboratively, which will help us make, if you will, grants that can be leveraged. So if you have that opportunity, it's something to think about. And of course, not to forget, our friend thought leadership. And I'm just going to put this last slide up as just an FYI. It is included in the handout, but these are some resources that I'm turning to on at least a daily or certainly a several times a week basis to give information about what's happening in our sector, and by the way, also even providing some potential ideas for content to help frame out grant proposals. So I appreciate your patience in letting me get through all of these different slides. And so it looks like we have a few minutes for some questions. And so why don't we get to those?
Yeah, so if anyone has any questions, go ahead and enter them into the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. John, the first one I saw come through is when you see organizations that have been successful in attracting grants, what are some of the common denominators for those organizations?
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, so the organizations I've experienced that have been successful in attracting grants, this is not going to be surprising, is at the top of the list, it's been the ones who have not been afraid to go back to their current funding partners and walking in with really a thoughtful situational picture and some vision about where they need to go next. So leveraging not only maybe an additional grant out of your existing grant makers or your grantors, but I've also seen that the nonprofits that have been absolutely willing to ask for help, asking their funders, can you open doors to other foundations? That has also played pretty well. And then I would say the third attribute are the charities I've experienced who, if anything, are putting more grant proposals into the pipeline. So they're not holding back.
All right, great. Another question from Bridget. What do you suggest is the best approach when requesting general support grant funding?
Oh, thanks, Bridget. And I was just having a conversation with a client this morning about this. I think that what seems to work effectively is instead of just putting in a proposal that describes the mission of your organization and the work of your organization, in other words, just giving a generic description of who you are and what you do, consider framing your proposal as, here is our mission, and generally here's what we do. But looking at our community and looking at our constituency, here are 2 or 3 significant challenges or opportunities that we see right now in 2021. And then you highlight a couple of the programs that you're offering that respond to these challenges and opportunities. And therefore, you're asking the grant maker to support your work as exemplified by these 2 programs or 3 programs. So it's putting a bit more specificity around the why and what you do. That might make the application and your message stand out a bit.
Awesome, thank you. And then another question from Ellen. Do you have any thoughts about leveraging your pandemic donors into future donors for more general programming?
Oh yes. Um, there's a number of charities who have been able to bring on new grants because all of a sudden you're offering exactly what they want. So they have now the opportunity to work with you. They see how you perform as a grantee. Um, the way you leverage is to start a conversation with the funder, um, you know, early. So it means, let's say you get a grant today from a new foundation or a foundation that's making a COVID relief grant. Instead of waiting until you send the final report in, and that might be a 6-month report or a 12-month report, pick a point right in the middle before your next report's due. Reach out to the funder, let them know informally, here's how we're doing. And it's okay to ask the question, is there a way that we could put a proposal in with you for continued work? And you start the conversation with what you're doing now and what promise that might have and what opportunities it might have. Um, this is something I'm encouraging every single organization I work with to do, is the more you get out there and talk to funders, and especially if you're doing it at a time when you're not asking for another grant or you're not putting in a report, it opens up a pretty interesting conversation. and makes it a bit easier for the funder.
All right, we got one more question from Paul. The Candid report highlights the increase in restricted and flexible grants for those funders that are not as flexible. What's holding them back given the unprecedented need?
Ah, so the funders that are not as flexible, there's a couple of things I think that tend to hold them back. One might be the charter of the foundation. This is one of the things that we have to remember, especially when you're dealing with a foundation. Uh, when a foundation is created, it has a specific mission. And if the foundation was created by a codicil of will, I'm sorry, I'm going to get into a little bit of legalese here. There are some very strict restrictions on how the money can be spent, whether it's a pandemic or not. So I've encountered this, you know, going to grant makers who, because of the codicil in the will that created the foundation, for some reason, the donor, if you will, said, "I don't want programs taking place on a public school campus." Well, even though you might need to be doing the program on a public school campus, the foundation can't help you just because it's really a legal matter. So that might be holding back some funders. I think the other thing that could be holding back some funders is that if they have very defined ideas of how they want to invest their emergency funding. So this means that some have decided that either A, they want to put it into fighting the actual disease. So not surprisingly, a lot of the $20 billion that was given is going into COVID research, into pushing us toward a vaccine and towards treatments. And then there's also just simple geography. I mean, where do they want to spend their money? Um, are they spending it here in the U.S. Or are they tacking to, I want to spend the money globally, which is, with the breaking down of barriers, so to speak, we're seeing a lot more international philanthropy that's coming online. So those, I think, are some of the reasons for the restrictions that you're saying.
All right, we've got one more question here. So, do you have any ideas for how small staff nonprofits without dedicated staff or resources for funding and prospecting could start incorporating some of these best practices? Also, is there an ask or a role of the board we could consider?
Okay, well, thanks very much. Yeah, and that is a challenge because I realize that with some agencies have the luxury of having more staff and more hands to actually work on grant proposals and prospect research. Um, for small shops, if you may actually have folks on the board that have some of these talents, and they may have some of the time. And if someone has the potential to be an extra set of hands, one of the nice things about Candid, I'm giving huge shouts out to Candid here today, is there's a lot of great online training resources that you can access there, that can help with, upskilling volunteers. Another thing is that there's, particularly through LinkedIn, I've been hearing that people have been able to find some pretty good pro bono assistance by putting out ads through places like channels like LinkedIn or Idealist, and I would consider that as well.
All right, and we'll do one more. This is from Leah. A small organization that's never received more than 70,000 annually, private funder, and 10 years in business, will now work with the school district on the program for helping students falling behind in reading. Do I show more strength in results rather than financial?
Absolutely, lead with results. I think it's going to be, and I think that the story I always think with a small, um, I think here's the story you have to tell. If you have like $70,000 in funding, and particularly if you're getting really good results, then literally the story you're telling to a funder is, hey, this is what I'm doing on a shoestring. Now imagine if I had a shoe, which means that if you're able to take more money, spend it on more resources, that can be curriculum, it can be staff, and you show that because you're partnering with the school district, because you're leveraging their resources. As a matter of fact, this is the more I'm sitting here talking about, the safer this contribution is starting to sound. Um, I think that's how you frame your ask, and I would put that totally front and center and going to a grant maker.
All right, great. Well, thank you everyone so much. And thank you, John, for your time today. I
Welcome.
know I truly enjoyed this presentation. I hope everyone else did as well. Following in the next 24 hours, you guys we'll all get an email containing the slides as well as the recording, and we'll be sure to call out some of these helpful resources that John provided as well. To check out what other webinars we have coming up, you can hop over to jmtconsulting.com and click on our events tab to view the full calendar, or check out the resources tab to browse past events and other nonprofit specific content that we produce. So everyone have a great day, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.